Greetings and salutations everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today, I'm going to be covering over an experimental vehicle from Japan, the OI Super Heavy Tank. In most cases, a behemoth in terms of size that is only matched barely by the likes of the Panzerkampfwagen 8, or better known as the Mouse, with it only winning in categories such as weight, where the Mouse weighs 188 tons compared to the OI's estimated 120 plus tons, and the length, which I'm going to be covering over later in the video when I talk about the specifications. Now, with the size context out of the way, I'll be now going into the history and specifications of the tank, as well as if there was any realistic chance of it being used effectively if the Japanese army decided to mass produce the tank. First things first, I need to go over the disclaimers with regards to the information. Since it is an experimental vehicle, there is limited amount of information about the OI due to it being one of the most secretive tank projects during the time of the Imperial Japanese Empire of the 1940s. There is not much in the way of concrete information that was publicly available, and most sources weren't exactly concrete in terms of legitimacy. But that all changed in 2015 when information came to light that some of the original documentation pertaining to the OI did indeed survive and was bought by a company called Fine Molds, a model kit company in Japan. Fine Molds do allow people to see the original documentation, drawings and various reports pertaining to the OI, but at a price on the information itself, as they own the files of the OI at Fine Molds headquarters. With the new information then being disseminated, it has led to a few changes regarding on what we know about the OI and disproves some of the previously assumed information that was initially thought to be real. Now, the only problem with this is because it is a recent development, namely only being about 6 years as of recording, there are many sites on the internet that has yet to update information on the OI, which leads to a lot of conflicting information on the tank. As a result, there is a limited amount of sites that have the most recently up-to-date information on the OI. So in case if I get something wrong about the tank, I will try to amend the video as best as I can with regards to if there is new information that pops up or there is something within the video that is not true. But without further ado, I'll be going over the sources I use for this video. One of the sources I could be using is encyclopedia.com, as they have the most extensive research on the OI. Now, the article, however, is under the category pending approval, so take the information with a pinch of salt, but I do trust the guys at Tanks Encyclopedia, as they have done a good job on backing up on what sources they use for the article. Another one I used was a form called Axis History Form, which goes into a bit more depth on certain things regarding OI, and I use these two sites to cross-reference each other. And of course I use Google Maps to get pictures of some of the locations. Links are going to be down in the description down below. Now, on to the history of how the OI came about. The OI was a response to the Japanese defeat in the Battle of Khalkhin-Go, where the Imperial Japanese Army realized that their Type 95 Hargos and the Type 97 Chaihars was not adequate against the Russians with their lightly armored hulls, proving a poor matchup against Russian tank guns and anti-tank infantry weaponry. And this is despite the fact that the Japanese cannons mounted onto the tanks were adequate in taking out the T-26s and the BTCs of tanks that the Russians fielded. Now, I'll be briefly given an overview of what happened in the Battle of Khalkhin-Go, which will begin its own video in the future. As this ain't a well-covered war, the Battle of Khalkhin-Go started in 1930s with the Japanese expanding into mainland Asia with the occupation of Manchuria in 1931. with an installment of a puppet government in Manchuria. Manchuria is on the direct borders of USSR and Mongolia, and at the time, Mongolia was under communist USSR's rule, and as time passed by and 1938 rolled round, with it came along one of the first major border conflicts between the Soviets and the Japanese. The Manchurian puppet government attempted to increase the field of their domain in Soviet territory, which failed to gain any ground. Then, as 1939 rolled around, and in May 1939, there were small skirmishes near the river of Kalkan-Go, which divides the borders of Mongolia and Manchuria. As a result of these small skirmishes, tensions began boiling, and it wasn't helped by either side increasing the size of armies that were deployed. On June the 2nd, Komkorgori Sukov was told by Commissar Defense Kemlet Vakoshi that Stalin wasn't happy with local command, and so Sukov was to take command of the 57th Special Corps and silence the Japanese provocations by forcing them to retreat. In this meeting, Sukov feared that he was going to be arrested and interrogated by the NKVD, or the commissars of the USSR. For the remainder of the month, small skirmishes would continue on isolated units, but the commander of the 23rd Japanese Infantry Division, Lieutenant General Michio Toro, received clear orders to expel the invaders. What followed in July was a two-pronged assault planned by the Japanese to push beyond the borders of the Kalkan-Go River, and it initially succeeded. But the Russians planned a counterattack, with the Russians utilizing the huge amount of BT series of tanks and some T-26s in a massive rapid counterattack without the support of infantry. This worked in annihilating the Japanese force, with the rapid movement of the BT series of tanks being able to attack the full Japanese army from 3 different sides, forcing them to retreat. And over the next 2 months, further battles continued, with the Japanese being pushed out and a ceasefire then being signed and then enacted on September the 5th, 1939. This was a small unofficial war, but it provided both sides with lessons and further knowledge on what their shortcomings were and how to improve it. And so, on the Japanese side, it was readily understood that tanks were going to play a bigger role in the future wars, and so annual tank production skyrocketed from 500 units to 1,200 units per year within 1939. As a result, Hideo Iwaka, the Chief of Army Affairs for the rest of this video, I'll be referring to him as Hideo for the rest of the video, instructed Colonel Murato, the head of the 4th Technical Research Institute, to construct a super heavy tank. Again, I'll be referring to him as the Colonel, as I'm not good with Japanese or foreign names. The precise words of Hideo was as stated: "I want a huge tank, which can be used as a mobile pillbox in the wide open plains of Manchuria. Top secret, make the dimensions twice that of today's tanks." During the time, the largest tank that the Imperial Japanese Army had at its disposal was the Type 95 heavy tank that weighs in about 26 tons. The requirement would see the weight of the tank increase from 26 tons to well over 100 tons. The order was made around 1939 to 1940, although the exact date ain't clear. This increase in size and weight made Colonel Murato's engineers worried, as the massive increases would end up causing a lot of headaches and unavoidable problems. but due to the strict nature of the Imperial Japanese military and to disapprove of the higher ranking officers' ideas, was looked at with extreme disgust and at worst could lead up to executions because the officer class might see the opinion as dishonorable, and the only thing that awaits a dishonorable person is death in the Japanese mind. As so, engineers kept their doubts to themselves. Now, the Japanese tanks of 1939 was the Japanese Type 95 Hago, which is here, Type 97 Chaiha, over here, Type 89 Igo, over here, and the Type 95 Heavy Tank, which is here. These tanks were lightly armoured, with the thickest armoured being the Type 95 Heavy Tank with only 35mm at the thickest, which is not ideal for a heavy tank. Knowing that, Hideo wanted the new tank to be twice the size of the Type 95 Heavy, which, as you can see in size comparison with the people in the background, is already massive in terms of size. Now, on to the design of the OI, which in this slide I'll be covering the size, weight and power of the design. The initial design was laid out in 1941. The specifications of the tank was that it was to be 10 meters in length, 4.2 meters in width, and 4 meters in height, which, if built, would be the biggest tank in World War II, as it surpassed the Maus, whose size is 10.2 meters in length, 3.7 meters in width, and 3.6 meters in height. The weight of the tank would be an estimated 120 tons, which would be at least 4 times heavier than the Type 95 Heavy Tank, which had the weight of 26 tons. The tank would be powered by 2 BMW licensed V12 Kawasaki H9 air-cooled gasoline engines that outputted 550 horsepower per engine, adding to a collective 1,100 horsepower to push the behemoth at speeds listed on the designs as 30 kilometers per hour, which for a tank at this size and weight would be a rather optimistic estimation. The transmission was a scaled up version of the Type 97 Chaiha's one, but of course made stronger and bigger to handle the increased weight of the tank as well as the increased power generated from the power plant. The fuel load is unknown, so any guess to the true operational range is unknown. Now onto the armament of the tank as well as the crew. The tank would feature 4 turrets, a main turret in the middle of the tank that housed a 150 Type 96 howitzer, 2 frontal turrets armed with 47mm guns, and 1 turret located in the back with a dual Type 97 heavy machine gun. There would be 11 crew members within the tank, a driver, a co-driver, a commander, a gunner for the main turret, and 2 loaders for the main gun, 2 47mm turret operators, a radio man, and an engineer. Now, the armor thickness. The armor thickness of the tank is 75mm plus 75mm on the front and back, adding to a collective of 150mm armor thickness. The side armor thickness would be 35 plus 35mm, adding to a collective 70mm thickness. The turret armor would be around 150mm. The roof armor would be 50mm at the thickest, which is a lot for a tank of the early 1940s. The armor measurements is listed as 2 separate plates to indicate that the armor was done in separate pieces, one on the tank itself and one that can be attached via bolting on it at a later date. It's not exactly known why this was done, but one of the reasons I can see why it was done is to simplify the construction process of the tank and armor, as if the armor was just one slab of metal it would require more heavy machinery to operate, and the processes the arm would have to go through will be made more complicated. Now, on to the development history of the prototype. The initial design was completed in March of 1941, and in the following month the engineers were selected to work on the project. There were 4 engineers that were interviewed after World War II had ended that worked on the project, with Shingo Otakuro being one of them, who was the main source of a lot of the information that we know about the OI. Now, down on the bottom is the 4 engineers that were interviewed, but I'm not too entirely sure on who is Shingo. These engineers were then taken to the 4th Technical Research Institute headquarters in Tokyo to begin work on the OI. The engineers were told not to speak of what they would see and were guided through the dimly lit barracks into a soundproof room with no windows, where they would later conduct meetings on the tank's construction. Exact starting dates of the project aren't known, but the project's time was initially estimated to be about 3 months for the construction to be completed. At this time, the project was going under a different name, namely MITO, with the MI standing for being manufactured by Mitsubishi, and with the TO meaning it was made in Tokyo. The only entry into the room was a set of double doors, acting much like an airlock. And the parts of the OI was given to officers over time, which was then fitted to make the OI prototype. During this construction period, there was numerous problems that started popping up, with one of the first ones being the tank's engine cooling systems, which delayed construction to January 1942. In January 1942, the whole of the OI was completed, and on the same month, Mitsubishi was making the turrets for the OI, but more problems kept popping up and construction was once again delayed, resulting in the tank not being constructed fully until the very next year. Once the MITO was constructed, it was assigned to the Imperial Japanese Army, and it was given the designation OI. Now, with the prototype fully built, it needed to be tested. The tank was then disassembled for transport, covered up in awning in an effort to keep the tank's parts away from enemy spies during transit. The tanks were then transported via truck to Sagami Armory in Sagamihara, 51 kilometers south of Tokyo. The army in today's world still exists, although it's under the name Sagami General Depot, which is now serves as a US Army post in Japan. The transporting of the tank was done by only the people who had worked directly on the tank. And this transportation job started at the darkness of 2 a.m. every day until dawn hits for about 10 days straight. After all the parts had arrived at the testing site, the tank was then rebuilt and the trials began. The details on the trials were not well documented, but we do know that the tank trials was done without the additional 75mm bolt-on armour on the front and back of the tank, as well as the main turret was missing, as the roof armour at the time was not ready. This resulted in the tank only weighing about 96 tons. During the day of testing, the Colonel Mirato was deployed in the front of the OI, and so in his place for observation was Lieutenant Colonel Hidemitsu Nakano. The chief of Sagami Armory, Torimoto Haru, was also present. The OI initially performed satisfactory. for the initial part of the test until the OI was maneuvering on off-road terrain where the tank sunk into the ground by about a meter. Attempts were made to get the tank out of the mud under its own power, but it ended up sinking even further, which resulted in the tank having to be towed out of the hole. After the tank was out of the hole, tests continue on concrete roads, but the damage to the tracks from when the tank got stuck in the mud ended up tearing up the concrete, which again further damaged the suspension even further to the point where the test could no longer be continued due to the suspension being in a unusable state. The tests were halted for the day and later cancelled out entirely due to the lack of materials and progress on the project. The tank was subsequently covered up in tarpaulin to hide it, and the OI was later scrapped, though the exact date for scrapping is unclear. All that remains of the OI is a single track link that was previously held at a shrine called Wakajishi Shrine, which is this shrine right here. But it's later been since moved to the Japanese ground self-defense camp in Tagihara, which is now on display today. Now, the main question, would the OI be fireable on the battlefield? First, let's go into the pros of the tank. The increased armor protection of the tank would improve the tank's abilities for tanking shots against enemy guns, tanks, as well as anti-tank weaponry fielded by the infantry, which will be useful in siege warfare and breakthrough warfare. The main 150mm gun would easily beat most, if not all, tanks of the 1940s and 1944 era. The two 47mm turrets on the front, whilst not being able to penetrate some of the tanks it might counter, it would be good in an anti-APC and light fortification war. And finally, the size and weight of the tank would make it useful in blocking entrances into forts and tunnels. Now it's time to cover the cons of the tank, and there is a lot of problems with this tank. The main problem is timing. The prototype was completed in 1943, and by the time it would be tested with the problems that would be found out during testing being ironed out, the tank wouldn't be ready until 1944, where it would be available in very small numbers. When it was ordered by Hideo in 1939 to 1940, the current tanks that were fielded by the Russians were the likes of the T-26, T-28 and the BT series of tanks. By 1943, when the prototype was undergoing testing, the Russian tanks that they had then was the T-34 76mm version, the KV-1 and the 85mm version, and the Su-152 tank destroyer. By the time the OI would be put in production after testing, it would most likely be mid to late 1944. At the time, the Soviets fielded T-34-85s, IS-1s and IS-2s. By the time the OI finished construction, there was numerous developments into other tanks, such as the Chito on the Japanese side, which would have been better to focus on, as it's significantly more smaller and more cheaper to make. Now, here's the timeline of the Russian tanks, and you can see the 1939 Battle Manchuria involved these tanks, the BT-7 and the T-26. By the time the OI prototype was finished and going through testing, the Su-152, which that is a massive gun, was being fielded at the time, as well as the infamous T-34 with the 75 76mm gun. Then in 1944, when the OI would have been available in decent numbers, the likes of the IS-2 and the T-34 85mm version would have been available in greater numbers. Now, on to the other cons of the design of the tank. One of the biggest ones is the height of the tank. Being as high as it is, it will make it a large target to both spot and attack with ground troops, aerial raids and bombing runs from the enemy's units. One of the biggest problems with the tank is that it featured no coaxial machine guns on the frontal turrets, which will limit the OI's ability in engaging ground infantry severely, to the point where it will be solely dependent on infantry formations, keeping the enemy's infantry away from the tank. Another problem of the tank is the heavy weight which will limit its field of operations, namely being able to operate on slopes and soft terrain like swamps, wetlands without getting stuck. Now, despite the side armor being quite thick, namely 70mm, the armor is not angled at all, so it presents a flat broadside for the enemy tanks and infantry to penetrate through the armor with tank rounds or handheld anti-tank weaponry that would be used by the infantry. The tank would be dependent on a very strong logistics line in order to keep the fuel guzzling 2 550 horsepower engines running, as well as the armors for the guns to operate. The last downside, and perhaps the biggest one, especially for Japan, is the material cost. For the exact same material cost in raw tons to make the OI, you can make 4 Cheeto medium tanks, which would be better as it requires less resources and less crew to man, with the Cheeto coming in at only 30 tons. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video on the OI's history. I'll be doing more stuff like this in the near future. Now, if you like this video, please comment and like and subscribe to the channel. Also down in the description down below, there's links to the sources I use, as well as links to all other social media sites I use. Now, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.